Hey, well, what's up, guys? Daniel here. And Amazon Prime's really highly anticipated biblical epic, The House of David, got off to a very promising start last week. Seems to be very well received. The fourth episode, The Song of Moses, is streaming now. Can it keep the momentum going? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So if any of you that watched my initial review of the first 3 episodes of this show, you know that I was really positive about it. I thought it was just a very strong and I think promising debut for the series. But for this kind of episode recap review, I'm not going to retread any of my general, more overall thoughts about the show. So if you haven't seen that review, encourage you go check out that as well. But instead, for kind of this episode recap review, I more wanted just to discuss my initial reaction, just various thoughts on this specific episode. And as I said in my first review, I think kind of with any biblical adaptation, there are 2 crucial elements. One, is it well made? Is it entertaining? And 2, is it faithful to the biblical text? So for these episode recaps and reviews, I do want to keep both of those questions kind of in front and in mind as we go. But all that being said, let's get into it. Overall, I thought this was yet again another very strong episode. I think it's probably the least action-packed of the 4 episodes so far, kind of focusing more on the human drama and the political intrigue, other than a brief moment of action towards the very end of this episode. I do think perhaps some viewers will find it a bit slow, at least relative to the other episodes, but I thought it was still very engaging throughout. I think kind of when you think of Game of Thrones type fantasy or sword and sandal epic shows, obviously, the big battles, the shocking moments are what most people talk about and remember after the fact. But I do think what sometimes does get lost in the shuffle of that is the fact that the reason that those moments are so impactful is because of the character work and the setup that led up to them. So I think in some ways this is a bit of a setup episode in that it mostly just moves characters around and positions them for where they need to be. But I think it also just introduces several fascinating, I think, kind of well done story threads that will pay off later. And biblically, this episode essentially covers the material from 1 Samuel 16 verses 14 to 23. And if you're wondering how can 9 short verses fill an hour-long episode, well, you can do that by just expanding character roles and kind of storylines and just fleshing out the events of that passage. And one of the ways that they do accomplish that is that kind of more minor characters in the biblical text are developed more, given a bit more backstory, a bit more to do. And you, in this episode, particularly get that with Eliab, which is David's oldest brother, and also Ishbosheth, who is Saul's younger son. And at least to me, 4 episodes into that, Eliab, David's brother, has been one of the show's unsung heroes. I just think this guy's awesome. I think his character is just in such an interesting place in the show, with sort of that developed tension of loyalty to his family kind of versus more loyalty to his nation or to his king. In fact, I think in general, this show has just done a really good job of humanizing its characters as more than black or white kind of caricatures. I think characters like Ishbosheth and even King Saul himself are clearly not the good guys, but they're still sympathetic in various ways. I think because the show has also established that, hey, they have relational bonds, they have cares, they have concerns, they have insecurities that just make them more relatable beyond just sort of being, mustache twirling villains. And as might be guessed from the episode's title, The Song of Moses, this episode has a very heavy focus on David as a musician, which I think is neat. Obviously, Goliath is sort of his main claim to fame for most people, but he wasn't just a giant slayer. He was also a prolific songwriter, and I'm glad that the show is leaning into that aspect of his character. But probably the biggest development that happens in this episode is that the 2 main characters and future adversaries, David and King Saul, share the screen for the first time, and the moment is almost surprisingly understated. But I'm glad that the show didn't go over the top to try and like just hit viewers over the head with the significance of the moment. And I think kind of in general, I do feel like this show has done well at just showing a little bit of restraint and like letting the story play out rather than constantly trying to like convince viewers either with the way the scene's set up or like the sweeping music of just like how important every moment is. I do think it is worth noting that like this meeting is a historically tricky passage in the Bible due to there being two seemingly like contradictory accounts of when David and Saul met, both with Saul being like welcomed into Saul's court first, but then also apparently kind of being introduced for the first time after the like Goliath encounter. And there's lots of debate and scholarship, about this, leading some scholars to, theorize like the story itself in the Bible wasn't written chronologically, which again wouldn't have been super uncommon with, the writing, approaches of the time. Personally, I've never cared too much to try and like, untie that knot, or I really don't think it does much to like alter the story or like undercut the reliability of scripture in any way. But clearly the show is going with like kind of the chronology of like how the narrative is, presented in the Bible itself. And I am curious like if they will ever address sort of that second introduction later or merely bypass it. But it does make sense just from like a storytelling kind of like hero's journey narrative perspective to build sort of the relationship of those two men earlier rather than later. And kind of the other big development in this episode is we do get a little romance between David and Michal. And kind of like a fun fact that I found while just kind of thinking through this episode is that in 1 Samuel 18:28, where it says Michal loved David, is actually the only time in the entire Bible that it is like explicitly written that a woman loved a man. And obviously lots of other women loved other men throughout the Bible, but it is the only time the Bible like clearly sort of establishes that relationship. And I think the relationship is off to a good start. I think there is chemistry between the two actors. At the same time, I do think there is a bit of like a softening or like Hollywoodization of some of like the historical facts of, the fact that David ultimately, according to scripture, will have many wives and concubines. And again, I don't think it's unexpected to not necessarily trod down those paths for the sake of the show. And I don't have a problem with them not doing that. But I do think it will sort of be worth monitoring just like how much of the series, particularly sort of with that dynamic, does like, I think, polish some of like the rougher edges of David's character in the biblical text. I think kind of thematically, really the primary theme in this episode is all about just justice. And I think in some ways that has kind of been the overarching motif of like the first 4 episodes. But with episode 4, you have sort of the law of Moses invoked towards Saul's son, kind of with, people calling for, punishment through stoning due to him being promiscuous with some of the kind of village leaders' daughters. And then later you have like the Song of Moses, which David and Michal read through together. And kind of the passage of that, which is quoted from Deuteronomy 32, is focused on sort of God's justice. And this actually kind of leads into, I think, one of the areas about this show that I do remain a little bit on the fence about. Kind of one of my questions so far through these first 4 episodes relates just to the way that like God has been clearly, I think, primarily, almost exclusively portrayed as like a God of wrath and justice, and not yet really showing him as like a God of mercy and love. And probably nothing like encapsulates sort of this theme in the show more than in the opening episode where the prophet Samuel, like hacks up the captured sorcerer witch doctor character and then declares to Saul's court that God will not be mocked. And obviously it's a pretty heavy metal, like cool moment in the show, and one that is taken directly from scripture itself. But I think it also is one that reflects God really in like a certain kind of more narrow light. And to be clear, I don't need this show to be like a super evangelistic vehicle. And I think the way that God revealed himself and, related to people in the Old Testament is, I think, different in some ways than how he would ultimately relate through people, through the person of Jesus or today. But I do hope that eventually we do get to see more like dimensions of God, and the show doesn't like overly or too narrowly focus just on more like the gritty wrath part. I think so far the show has done a good job of showing God as being worthy of like reverence and obedience, but he still remains like very distant. And finally, just sort of some miscellaneous things that I liked or noticed about this episode. I really enjoyed the quote by Samuel where he says, "You don't need to understand something to feel its power. And then how that's kind of like, bookend later with David saying, mystery is a part of knowing God. Another kind of small moment that I really liked in this episode was in David's sister giving him back the lion claw that he had got from a previous episode. And I hope that that becomes kind of like a recurrent bit of symbolism. Because obviously, eventually in 1 Samuel 17:37, David will declare, the God who rescued me from, the paw of the lion will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. And I like the way that they've sort of been introducing that in a visual motif already. Kind of a last thing, I'm still a little bit mixed on the way that this show has been adapting some of the more spiritual elements in a more seemingly fantastical way. I mentioned with my first review that at least in his introduction, I found Goliath to be a little bit too hokey and kind of fantastical, mythological, and I kind of feel similar to the way that this show has dealt with visions from gods, that especially David in this, and also Samuel are receiving. I think the show at times feels very kind of grounded and historical, but then in other ways it feels almost more like mythology than it is an adaptation of true historical events. I think it does represent this kind of a tension of intent for the show that I don't think there's any easy answers for it either way, but sort of is this show designed to help viewers see that this story is not just sort of ancient fiction, but it's real historical events that did indeed happen? Or is the intent more to adapt the story in the mold of exciting fiction in order to explore kind of more spiritual themes and meanings? But overall, I still am really enjoying this show. We're now halfway through the season. There's obviously a lot of big moments coming on the horizon. We still got Goliath and just a lot of other rich material to be adapted from the biblical text. But I think just judging on this episode and then the previous three, that this show is probably some of the best faith-based entertainment that I have ever watched. And it seems like a lot of other people are, similarly having a positive experience with it. But hey, we'd love to hear what you think. If you've been following the show, if you're kind of as on board as I am, or if you're maybe a bit more reluctant about some of the creative liberties that, the adaptation is taking from the biblical text, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about the show, about the episode. And if you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other, movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through the world for Christ.